Mr. Dakota Bates, the president of the College Republicans at Idaho State University, penned a fairly nasty column about myself, and he submitted it to the Idaho State Journal, and it was published today, April 3rd, 2014. Now, I'm going to ignore the ugly slams and the inappropriate comments made by Mr. Bates, and I'm going to focus just on the issues at hand. And specifically, the issue is this. He is defending the protection of Obamacare because he states that it is federal law and that we have no rights or powers to do anything other than support it as federal law. So let's have a look. But before I get into his specific concerns, I would like to have a short constitutional discussion. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 1, states, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Now, this couldn't be more clear. It simply says that all law must be made by Congress. That there is no legislative power that exists outside of Congress. Now, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lists those things that Congress can do. It specifically states the areas in which Congress can make laws. Now, the Republican Party, of which Mr. Bates claims to be a member, has built its foundations on the idea of limited government. And this is the portion of the Constitution that limits the government. And I'm going to briefly touch on each of these items. Article 1, Section 8 states that Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, to borrow money, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. Now, I want you to remember this one. It's among the states. This is regulating commerce between Wyoming and Michigan. It does not regulate commerce inside of the states. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization and bankruptcies, to coin money, to provide for punishment for those who counterfeit our money, to establish post offices and post roads, to promote and progress the science and useful arts. And then it goes on to explain what is now our trademark and patent law. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, to define and punish piracies on the high seas, to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district. And then it talks about these districts. These are places that are in total government control, military bases, that sort of thing. And hence we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And finally, the last one, it says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. Back this up and listen again. They can only make laws within the scope of the powers which are given them by the Constitution. Now, if you jump through the Constitution, you will find that, for the most part, the rest of the Constitution talks about administrative functions of the government, how the government is to operate, the process by which bills pass through the House and the Senate and eventually land on the president's desk, and how they can be signed into law or vetoed, and what Congress can do in the event of a veto. There's really only one other section of the Constitution that grants any significant power to Congress, and that is Article 5, which states how Congress can create constitutional amendments. Now, speaking of constitutional amendments, we have the 10th Amendment. And apparently the question of what federal powers are and how they can be executed was raised early on, and so they added the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. And this just simply states the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or the people. This is so clear. This is so understandable that anyone who is capable of reading the English language can understand this without question. And it simply states this: beyond those powers expressly enumerated in the Constitution, the federal government has no other power. And this is important that we understand this, because we are supposed to be a limited government. And you can see that the 10th Amendment reserves those powers to the states and the people. We are supposed to be a government of the people and for the people and by the people. Not of the government over the people. So, I believe I've made my point clear enough. The federal government is limited, extensively limited. Now, Mr. Bates challenges my belief that we in the states have the right to nullify unconstitutional law like Obamacare. And he brings some interesting constitutional questions, which I would like to share at this point. Article 6, Clause 2. This is known as the Supremacy Clause, and it says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof." Now, in pursuance thereof. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance of, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay, the key here is that federal law is only the supreme law of the land if it is made in pursuance to the terms of the Constitution, which means that any laws that go beyond the scope of the powers granted to the federal government by the Constitution are not laws. They are not the supreme law of the land, and we, the people, and the states have no obligation to enforce unconstitutional laws, because an unconstitutional law is no law at all. Now, Mr. Bates asserts that once it goes into law, and it doesn't matter how it becomes law, by hook or crook, we have every obligation to follow that law. Now, that is foolishness to an extreme. And sadly, that is what my opponent, Kelly Packer, believes. Now, he also talks about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. I assume when he talks about the 14th Amendment, he's talking about Section 5. And that says that Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Now, again, by appropriate legislation. Appropriate legislation can only be legislation which is bound inside the scope of those limits which are placed on the federal government by the Constitution. And so any law that is created outside of those limitations is unconstitutional, and therefore it is no law at all. Now, my stance has been that we should nullify these laws. We just simply say, this law is not constitutional, and here in our state, here in Idaho, we are not going to enforce this law. We have the right to do that. Now, who says we have the right to do that? The country was brand new. John Adams was our president. And the president signed into law a bill called the Sedition Act. Now, the Sedition Act stated that it was illegal to speak badly of the president or of Congress. Now, wait a minute. The Bill of Rights was already in existence, and the ink was barely dry on that document. The Bill of Rights stated in the very first amendment that we have freedom of speech, and the Sedition Act said we don't. Therefore, the Sedition Act was not constitutional. So Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution, and at the same time, James Madison wrote the Virginia Resolution. Now, who are these men that we should care what they think? Oh, I don't know. Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence. Some might say that that gives him a little bit of credibility. James Madison wrote the first draft of the U.S. Constitution. Some might suggest that that places him in a position of authority. And both of these men came to the same conclusion in their resolutions. They stated that when the federal government begins to color outside of the constitutional lines, that the rightful remedy is state nullification. They stated that we are duty-bound in the states to oppose and to refuse to enforce unconstitutional law. Now, these resolutions were submitted to Kentucky and to the legislature in Virginia, and they passed. And then they were submitted to the other states. And something very interesting happened. Most of the other states were in opposition to these resolutions. They said, we like the idea of the Sedition Act. So this shows that people, even early in our country's history, could be led astray and could be convinced to do foolish and stupid things. But here's what is interesting. Primarily, it was the northern states that were in opposition to these resolutions. And so they didn't pass in those states. But not very many years later, the northern states began to complain about some taxes, levies that were being forced on them by the federal government. And do you know what they used to make those unfair laws go away? Nullification. They refused to comply. A few short years after that, they had an act called the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, this is where runaway slaves were trying to get to the northern states where they could be free. And the Fugitive Slave Act said that they have to be returned. And there were bounty hunters that would go into the northern states, and they would grab up people and return them to the southern states. And think about how this could work. He goes up there with a description of a runaway slave. It says, oh, he's average height, average build, black nappy hair, black skin, brown eyes. There he is. And he would grab up someone and take him back south. Now, what guarantees did we have that those people being snatched and returned to the south weren't legally freed black people? We have none. Now, the northern states refused. They used nullification. They said no way. And Wisconsin was especially heroic in this. They would not allow people to come into their state and snatch up black people and return them to the south. Nullification works. Now, there are those that say, well, not today, maybe then, but it's a different time. 2005, the Real ID Act. This was a federal government attempt to take over the issue of driver's licenses and ID cards. 24 states said, no way. This is a state function. It's going to remain a state function, and we will not enforce this federal corruption in our states. Now, the federal government postured and fussed and threatened. And in the end, they had two choices. They could arrest half the American citizens, and where are you going to put them? Or they could make their stupid, unconstitutional law go away. Do you know why you've never heard of the Real ID Act? Because it doesn't exist. And why doesn't it exist? Because of nullification. Now let's go to our very recent history. There were those in our legislature that wanted to oppose Obamacare. There were those that wanted to oppose Common Core. There are those that wanted to oppose abortion funding in our states. And these people brought forward bills to our state legislature that would have nullified these unconstitutional laws. And Butch Otter put together his gang of 18. These were a bunch of freshman legislators that he smoothed and schmoozed, and he got them to follow him. And they said, nullification is not possible because Obamacare is federal law. Now, let's stop right here and examine Obamacare. As I ran through the list of powers granted to Congress, did you hear me mention at any time the right to mandate health care? I didn't either. It's not there. Therefore, those who created Obamacare were coloring outside of the constitutional lines, and the law is not constitutional. Now, just to further prove my point, do you remember Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution? That says that all legislative powers are vested in Congress. And now do you remember time and time and time again when President Obama changed the terms of Obamacare with executive orders? See, he's now writing law, even though the Constitution states that he has no legislative powers. Again and again and again, Obamacare has slipped further and further and further from constitutional principles. Butch Otter, Kelly Packer, and the rest of the Gang of 18, they said, oh, it's federal law, we have to play along. And the federal government gave Idaho two choices. You can either go with the federal exchange or you can create your own. And our ridiculous elected officials said, well, we're going to exercise our state sovereignty and fight against the federal government by refusing to do what they demand, by doing exactly what they demand. You see, the government gave us two choices, federal exchange or state exchange. The only rightful remedy, according to Jefferson and according to Madison, and oh, by the way, according to Justice Roberts, you may remember him, he's the one that ruled on the constitutionality of Obamacare. He stated that the states are sovereign units, and it's time that they start acting like it. He literally put the power in our hands to fight Obamacare. Now, our lawmakers didn't want to do that. But yet, just weeks ago, Butch Otter signed into law another bill which nullified all future federal gun control laws. Think about this. Does this just mean that our government is like a blade of grass and they point whichever way the wind blows? No, it's not that simple. You see, in the case of unconstitutional bills that have been passed by our state recently, like Obamacare and Common Core and even medical abortions, there were huge financial bribes from the federal government. Big money was being offered. And not only that, but the pockets of our lawmakers were being lined by money from Blue Cross and others if they would go along and play along. And why would Blue Cross want Obamacare? Well, heck, it forces everyone to be a customer. And why would Blue Cross want medical abortions? Because they're lucrative. And so our legislators, our governor, played along. And in the case of these three things, abortion, Common Core, Obamacare, they said nullification isn't possible. But the gun control law, which nullified all future federal gun control legislation, was passed. And why? Because there was no money to be made by doing otherwise, and Butch Otter and unconstitutional legislators needed to look good in our eyes to garner votes. But you know, the ridiculous part of this bill is that it is pointless. It's just feel good, but it does nothing. How can you nullify a law that doesn't exist? You see, any nullification effort must be supported with proof of unconstitutional behavior on the part of the federal government. So the knotheads in Boise signed a law nullifying laws that don't exist, and they can't do that because there's no constitutional violation, because there's no law to nullify. So, back to the Constitution. Mr. Bates suggests that I should take a Constitution class at Idaho State University. He is a declared Republican, and yet he goes to Idaho State University to learn about the Constitution. What is the Idaho State University if not the hotbed of democratic, socialist, left-wing, liberal nut jobs? This is like wanting to become a world-famous chef and going to the Chef Boyardee Culinary School. I mean, good grief, what are you thinking? Why would you go to the camp of those who have done nothing but try to violate the Constitution, to give the government power over us, to impose socialist nightmares on us? The whole collectivism nonsense, that all comes out of the Idaho State University, and this is where Mr. Bates thinks we should study the Constitution. You see, the Constitution is a beautiful document. It is the document about government for the people, by the people, of the people. It was written in simple English. If you can read, you can understand. And the real tragedy in America is not that we have to take a Constitution class in order to understand what the Constitution says. No, that's not true. The tragedy is not that we have to rely on the Supreme Court to decide if things are constitutional or not. No, that's false as well. The tragedy is that the people of the United States have chosen to believe these lies because they have never taken the opportunity to read the Constitution for themselves. Because if they did, they would discover that they understand it. They would discover that they know how our government is supposed to operate. They would discover that there is every evidence that our government is corrupt and evil, and that those who lead us are not our leaders, they are not our friends, they are domestic enemies in many cases. Now, Mr. Bates, I would agree with you that higher education is important, but more and more it seems to me that higher education no longer teaches people how to think, but it teaches people what to think. It indoctrinates. And you, my friend, are my proof. I'm Lance Earl. I'll see you soon.